All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this auDA webinar. We'll just give it a couple more minutes while people are joining, if you could just stay on the line and we'll be with you shortly. Thank you. All right. Well, I know we'll have people filtering in over the next minute or so, but while that's occurring, I'll just do the welcome and introductions and then throw to our speakers for today. So for those who don't know me, I'm Sophie Mitchell and I'm auDA's Chief Communications Officer. And I wanted to thank you for joining us today for the launch of auDA's Future Scenarios Project Report. I note this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available online after the event on auDA's website. So, future scenarios. We're really lucky to have undertaken this work over the course of the last 9 months with input from across auDA's staff, our board, our advisory committees, and also from a wide number of experts from a broad range of industries, both locally and across the globe. And we know some of them are joining us today online, and we thank you. But to discuss the project and the report in greater detail, we have with us today auDA's CEO, Rosemary Sinclair, accompanied by Dr Matt Finch, who supported auDA in this project. Matt is a strategy and foresight practitioner and principal at Mechanical Dolphin, and also the Associate Fellow at the Sayed Business School at the University of Oxford. And I'll throw to them shortly. Rosemary will set out why auDA undertook this project, and Matt will set out the scenario building methodology. And they will then join in a discussion on the project before we pause to take some questions from you, our audience today. So with that brief introduction, I will now hand over to Rosemary. Over to you, Rosemary.
Thanks, Sophie, and I'll first unmute myself. It's very clever. Let me start by just saying that I'm really thrilled that we're all here today to discuss what I think is a really important and change potential project. Some in the room might be wondering why we did the project, why we spent so much time musing about the future environment in which we might find ourselves and what would our place be in that. But from our point of view, we couldn't see any other way forward than to think deeply and carefully about the future. One reason is a really practical reason, and that is our current 5-year corporate strategy is about to come to an end, and we've got to start on the development of the next strategy. The second and broader reason is that I think that we all have a sense that the future, the challenges that we all face wherever we are, and the opportunities that will arise will be very different to the challenges and opportunities that have got us to this point. At auDA, we generally spend a lot of time thinking about the future because of the work that we're doing in managing the .au domain for the benefit of all Australians. We think about the way Australians use and depend on the internet. We think about the key role the domain name system has, the challenges it might face, the way we engage with the local and global community of interested stakeholders, and how best to manage the .au so that it supports Australia's economy and community needs into the future. And to navigate that future is the reason that we undertook this Future Scenarios project. We were, as Sophie mentioned earlier, really lucky to be joined in this work by Dr Matt Finch, and I am absolutely delighted that he is able to join us here today to discuss the general practice of scenario building, and in particular, the work that we've done together, which has landed in our Future Scenarios project report. Matt, let me hand the baton to you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you all And at the outset, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we're each on and pay my respects to elders past and present. I've been privileged over the years to work with a wide range of public sector, private, non-profit, intergovernmental and multi-governmental bodies on strategy, foresight, decision-making and policy under conditions of uncertainty, including the practice of scenario planning. And recent public work includes, for example, advising on last year's Ukraine 2040 scenarios developed for the British and Ukrainian parliaments, which can now be found online. I wanted to begin just by setting out that in this case at auDA, we've been thinking of scenarios in that tradition developed at the University of Oxford Saïd Business School, not as projections of the future, not as predictions, not as forecasts to which one can assign probabilities, nor even as expressions of the future we would like to see. The word scenarios is used in so many different ways now. We think, for example, of the IPCC climate change scenarios. It's important to be clear about what we mean by scenarios and how we're using them. And in this case, scenarios at auDA have been a way of exploring our context and particularly the uncertainties within and around it, the forces and factors which we perceive to be beyond our influence or beyond our ability to predict, and yet which have the power to redraw the world in which we operate. Under the so-called tuna conditions of turbulence, unpredictable uncertainty, novelty, and ambiguity, that sense Rosemary just described, that things might not remain as they were, and we can't rely on tomorrow being like today or yesterday, that's when scenarios let us explore how uncertainties in our environment might play out over time. And what, you might ask, has all this to do with the pyramids? Well, this sense of contextual uncertainty is a matter of perception and perspective as much as anything else. Our understanding of our environment depends on where we stand and the frame through which we make sense of what's going on, our institutions, our disciplinary background, our position within the evolving geopolitical context. And my colleague at Oxford University, Cho Kong, likes to use the example of the pyramids. They're typically seen from one angle, like this, as majestic, historic, and worthy of the guidebooks, all of which is true. But if we move forward one slide here, seen from another point of view, we are made to reckon with their context in a different way. From this fresh perspective, new aspects, new actors, new dynamics, which were always there, are revealed. Scenarios, by offering a small set of contrasting, plausible, relevant, but challenging descriptions of the future context, can create what you might think of as artificial hindsight. Instead of physically moving our camera to get a fresh perspective on the pyramids, we move strategically through time into the future, changing our perspective to get the benefit of hindsight, even when matters are uncertain. And like the historic pyramids, it's not that we forget all that's come before in terms of the history of the internet and its governance, nor that the old perspectives were necessarily untrue. It's just that scenarios let us see things afresh with a broader appreciation of that currently unfolding context. And I think this image is a great reminder how even the legacy of antiquity exists within a world which is continuing to change with all kinds of unfolding dynamics. If we might move forward one more slide. What this means is that it's just important at the outset of this discussion to bear in mind the distinction between scenarios, options, and strategy. Scenarios being understood as plausible future contexts, options, what an organization might choose to do within these unfolding contexts, and then strategy, the difficult work of deciding what we will actually do, whether individually as institutions or collectively in all kinds of potential collaborations, configurations, and conversations. And to those of you on the call today or watching the recording later, to the wider internet governance community and everyone who has an interest in our digitally networked world, which really at this point is pretty much everyone on the planet, auDA is offering up a set of plausible, contrasting, challenging, and relevant future contexts intended to help us think differently about the situation as it is today and have a different kind of strategic conversation. So if we might change the slide again. To be specific, what we've done over a 9-month period is to build scenarios by mapping 2 aspects of the domestic and international ecosystem to which Rosemary's already referred, that vast stakeholder network within which auDA operates. This consists, in the way we framed it and in the diagram you see here on the screen, of a transactional island inhabited by actors and relationships that auDA interacts with already today, and then a surrounding sea of contextual uncertainties with the power to come ashore over time and redraw the map of that island in ways which challenge current expectations. How did we figure out the expectations we were going to challenge? At the outset of this project, a series of in-depth interviews with key stakeholders and thought leaders from around the world helped us to grasp current understandings, assumptions, hopes, and fears even of what the future might hold, bolstered in turn by work internally at auDA, including a whole staff survey. We then ran a series of workshops with auDA's leadership team and with external participants from across big tech, civil society, academia, government, internet governance, business, and the wider public sector. And these serve to explore different ways that forces in that sea of uncertainty might come ashore over time in different combinations and different directions. And this led to 3 draft scenarios that were further developed and tested with expert respondents whose unique insights honed that balance of being challenging, relevant, and plausible. And I think perhaps the scenarios went through another 14 drafts or more on that journey towards the material that's going to be presented today. It really has been quite the adventure. If we move forward one more slide. It's good to have spoken a little bit about the approach that was taken and the choices we made in leading to these scenarios, but now is the moment to begin introducing them as an overview. I'm going to go through these scenarios one at a time. State of alert, in which the overriding priority has become national security. Ecological civilization, in which by the year 2044, sustainability and resilience in the face of climate catastrophe have become the overriding priority. And finally, the price is right, in which the priority has become profit in a world in which corporations and the private sector have taken on many of the roles that we traditionally associate with the nation state. So I give you a moment here just to take in mind that these scenarios are a set. Because of that quality they have of contrasting with one another, we consider them all at once as 3 different future contexts, each of which might have purchase on our minds and on our assumptions. And now if we move forward one slide, I'll take you through the first scenario, state of alert. In state of alert, national security is the priority in a world of global tensions. By 2044, we face a world characterized by rising geopolitical competition and the increasingly severe impacts of climate change. As security becomes more important than liberty to many citizens around the world in this fearful and risk-averse environment, representative democracy gives way to new AI-enabled forms of governance, validated by citizen assemblies providing accountability. The internet is divided into geopolitical blocks connected by drawbridges only when necessary. People are expected to be citizen soldiers in a world which conflates national security against geopolitical rivals with the issue of the fight against climate change, and citizens earn social credits by doing their civic duty in this world. Dissent is now restricted, flourishing only covertly in the gaming spaces where many now spend their free time, as tourism and international travel in person have been drastically reduced. In this world, in 2044, information is the property of the state, and it is citizens' duty to produce it. Identity is biometrically linked with a single identifier for each user within a national system. The internet is a critical national security asset divided along geopolitical lines with protocols designed to maximize security within each block and sharpen competitiveness against international rivals. Individuals earn their rights and access to technological privileges through citizen service, and privacy is unpatriotic It impedes one's upward social mobility, and sharing data has come to be seen as a cultural norm. And what I shall do here is just give you a few seconds to reflect on that first scenario, state of alert. Often with the initial presentation of this kind of work, it's a lot to take in. One can, of course, return to the report, dig deeper, insights will come over time. But in this first moment, hearing these words, seeing the material presented on the screen, what springs to mind? What do you think? Yes, I already see some of this today. What parts do you have a reaction to where you think, no, that can't be, that feels implausible, that troubles me? Just take a moment and consider your response to state of alert. And now if we move on one more slide. Scenario 2, entitled Ecological Civilization, shows us a vision of 2044 in which collective resilience is the priority in a world where environmental catastrophe can no longer be ignored. In this world, crises once expected to happen once in a century have become the widespread and unpredictable norm. The systemic nature of this collapse, respecting no border or boundary drawn by human beings, has led humanity to recognize that it must pull together to meet an existential environmental threat. With centers of economic and geopolitical power having moved eastward over the last 20 years, by 2044, these efforts are spearheaded by new geopolitical powers supported by a global network of eco-cooperatives offering mutual aid either through geographical proximity or by distance online. Digital infrastructure now incorporates the natural world so that we see an internet of everything, which extends into orbit and includes animal-computer interaction and plant-computer interaction with no humans in the loop. And in addition, this experience of computers interacting directly with animals and plants has shaped and informed human-computer interaction. So there are now new forms of haptic, immersive, and sensory communication between humans and machines. In this world, information is open wherever possible. Everyone should have the tools and resources they need to play their part in the climate battle, with significant implications for intellectual property regimes and the ways in which the content layer and technical layer of the internet are regulated. Identity has become open and transparent to all as part of global environmental auditing. The internet is federalized, serving as the basis for global climate debate and solutioneering, plus community building, with protocols emphasizing resilience, interoperability, and open scrutiny. Individuals recognize they must put the community's needs first as part of minding their place in an evidently fragile ecosystem. And privacy in this scenario has become a matter of abstinence from the digital environment. Reducing your voluntary digital interactions reduces your surveillance footprint as well as one's environmental impact. Again, I'm going to pause for a few seconds here as you take in ecological civilization and its very different vision of the world in 2044. And what I would say here with this and every other scenario, as well as the whole set, is that it is not necessarily that one has a lightning bolt revelation right here and right now during a few minutes on a webinar or watching a recording. It is that this initial encounter with the scenarios plants a seed of thought, and that seed might sprout and come to fruition after this call, this weekend, next week, watching that video later down the line, next month, at some moment when you read a news headline which suddenly surprisingly chimes with these scenarios. The aim in this first encounter is just to feel what is resonant, what is comfortable or uncomfortable, what rings true or what seems jarring, but understanding that some of these feelings, intuitions, realizations, and insights might actually come in the wake of the conversation we're having now. I'll just give you a couple more seconds to think about ecological civilization. And then if we might move on. The third scenario, entitled Price is Right, presents a world in which profit is the priority and corporations have transcended the nation state. In this scenario, through the 2020s, citizens lost trust in the state's ability to protect them from ceaseless AI-powered cyber attacks and disinformation, which increasingly had impacts in the physical world and on everyday life. At the same time, a series of high-profile, drastic technological breakthroughs by the private sector has increased faith in celebrity tycoons as saviors of humanity. By 2044, former public services are offered on a subscription basis, with surge pricing taking the role of taxation. And even domains that once would have been considered unimaginable for the nation state to let go of, such as defense and law enforcement, are now privatized. This is a world in which the police might attend to a crime against you, but you might want to have justice insurance to ensure full investigation and full pursuit of that crime. Citizens in this world are consumers first and foremost, and the boards of big business write the rules of global governance. Environmental crises have come to be seen as technological and behavioral science challenges at every level, from the individual to the whole population. In this scenario, information of every kind is a tradable commodity. Identity is multiple, provisional, and tied to individual subscriptions as consumers hold different identities across different platforms. The internet is global. It is vital to commerce and corporate research and development, and its protocols are designed to maximize opportunities for profit and innovation. Individuals in this scenario use different personas for different services and must take increasing responsibility for matters which were once the preserve of the state. Privacy in The Price is Right has become a privilege to be traded by brokers on data exchanges. And once again, I'm just going to take a few moments here just to focus on this third and final scenario, to reflect on your initial reactions, responses, and your curiosity about this world in which profit is the priority and corporations have transcended the nation state. And then if we might move forward one more slide. Now, scenarios function ultimately as a set. You'll recall that word contrasting, which is just as important at the notion that they will be plausible, relevant, and challenging. So we've prepared this comparison slide, just running back through those key themes which were drawn out each time: information, identity, the internet, individuals, and privacy. And I recall the conversation a year ago or more now with Rosemary and Sophie, where we sat at a cafe table outdoors in Australia and began to consider the different aspects that one might want to compare across a scenario set. The reason I do this is for you to have a chance to see how these fundamentals, these questions of information, identity, the internet, individuals, and privacy play out very distinctively in each of the three scenarios, but also differ from the way we might understand those today. And it is a chance also to consider how these scenarios are very much not about predicting what is definitely going to happen, but stretching our sense of what might transpire. And also that these are not in any way expressions of desired future states. So you will note, for example, that bottom line on privacy. The notions of privacy we see in each scenario in 2044 are rather different from those which many in civil society, in institutions, in activist groups might want to preserve or foster or increase in the here and now. These are scenarios in many ways in which privacy as we know it no longer exists. And that is not to say that this is a foregone conclusion or this is a desirable state. In fact, if you consider auDA's mandate, this is very much not the case that we are steering towards any one of these futures. Rather, it is a sense that these scenarios serve a little bit like the wind tunnel which aircraft designers use to test their aeroplanes. They say, if I put this airplane in the wind tunnel and subject it to different meteorological conditions, how well does my design fare? Is it efficient, elegant? Is it robust and resilient? Will it be able to take flight and get to its destination? In the same way, if you have a policy, a procedure, a principle, a point of view, an operation or a strategy that you need to enact, these scenarios provide an opportunity when it comes to questions of internet governance to say, how would I achieve that goal? How would I carry it out if the winds started to blow in this direction and these were the meteorological conditions that I face? And I think, for example, of the work of the Oxford philosopher Carissa Velis, whose book Privacy is Power is very much a call for us not to let go of the right to privacy, grounding it even in biological fundamentals. And one of her fundamental insights, drawing on the work of Bertrand Russell, is that actually this is really a question of power, and power can transform from one state to another. So military power can obtain political power, economic power can obtain military power, political power can also obtain other forms of power. And one of her arguments is that the power we now derive from data is a new form of power, which also serves in this way that it can transform and it can allow actors to acquire different kinds of power, as well as being acquired in its own right. So it's really a chance for us to think about power dynamics, but also how we might choose to move forward in a way that respects the sense that the future might unfold in ways other than those we were predicting. And the very last thing I want to say about this, because I think it's one of the most sophisticated potential uses of scenarios, is when you regard state of alert, ecological civilization, the price is right, all of which are challenging in their own ways. They're not necessarily utopian or dystopian, but they're certainly discomforting to some of our current expectations and assumptions. The other thing to do is to flip the telescope of time and not say, which scenario do I gravitate towards? Which do I think is most attractive, or which do I think is most plausible? Rather, it is to use that notion of artificial hindsight, which I spoke of earlier, and say, if one of these scenarios was definitely ahead of us, how would they look back on the apparently wise decision I am making today? How would I be judged if this future was the one to eventuate? If I bet entirely on the power of state regulation, how will my choices look if we move towards the price is right? If we believe that capitalism will continue as it has with minimal adaptation to environmental changes and the climate catastrophe, how will my strategies look if we end up moving towards a world which is more like ecological civilization? And perhaps the last thing to say is that this work emerges from exploring uncertainties that already exist around us here and now, and a perception of where the limits of our agency may lie. So while we moved forward to 2044 to gain that fresh perspective, to see the pyramids from a new angle, actually, these are pressing issues of the here and now, and they may only be emergent. Some of them, it is uncertain how they will play out and whether they will fully play out, but they are already here and they speak to the concerns of those of us involved with internet governance right here, right now in 2024. So having given you a last few moments to reflect on the set as a whole, I'm very pleased to yield back to Sophie and move forward on the discussion with Rosemary. Thank you so much for your time and your attention, and I hope you'll dig deeper into the full report.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for that great summary of both the methodology through which we approached the report, for all of the work that went on behind the scenes, and for that fantastic summary of the 3 scenarios, which, as you mentioned, should be read as a set. And for those who have been following along, a copy of the report or a link to it has been dropped into the webinar chat. So please do make your way there and click on that should you wish to read it in further detail, or perhaps share it with others after this webinar. And also a reminder to those in our audience to please place any questions you might have for Matt or Rosemary into the Zoom Q&A, and we'll attend to those shortly. But in the meantime, I'd like to start with a question for you, Rosemary. I think, as I said, Matt did a great job setting out the 3 scenarios for our audience. And I think it's safe to say that some of those scenarios might seem quite challenging or even unappealing to people. And I'd like to put to you, how is it that we should use these scenarios to work towards a future that we would like to have, or perhaps just one we might like to work within?
Yeah, I think the purpose of scenarios is to challenge and to make us feel uncomfortable. The issue for me really is that it's very easy, particularly when you're deeply knowledgeable, to get quite complacent about what's going on. And in our case, for example, it's very easy for us to see the whole world through the lens of a .au domain name holder. If I think about the scenarios give me quite different lenses on the users and potential users of .au domain. In the security scenario, for example, people become security points, and we focus on the security of the domain almost at any cost. If I think about ecological civilization, then people are community members banding together, consulting, collaborating, wanting the tools that enable them to do that. And if I think about The Price is Right, then I could conceive of people as wallets. It's purely about commerce and transactions, and enabling that to run smoothly is the most important thing to do. So it's for me, Sophie, about challenging complacency, and for auDA, I think it's particularly about making sure that we're building the capabilities now that will be needed in the future. So that's how I think about them.
Thanks, Rosemary, and certainly hope so. And Matt, I have a question. I think I'll throw it to you. It's from our audience, and they ask, I think the question popped in during your summary of State of Alert, but it perhaps is relevant to all of the scenarios. And the question is, what are our views on the role of international organisations such as the UN or the WTO to enforce rules and regulations and prioritise safety over economic interests? And again, you may reflect on that just on the State of Alert or on any of those scenarios.
Thank you, Sophie. Yes, it's a great question. I think each of the scenarios really forces us to think about international organizations and institutions and the role they might play in that future of internet governance. So for me, in the question of State of Alert, it really depends on the severity with which those blocks separate from one another. It might be as much about the evolution of the alliances we currently see, like AUKUS and Five Eyes. It's a question of in which fora will questions of internet governance be litigated? And we can already see, again, speaking to the questions of the here and now, there have been many discussions of whether the ITU, whether ICANN, which will be the body that continues to administer things like domain names in times to come, is already something which is debated from certain positions in certain perspectives. But we also see, for example, that in ecological civilization, there's this great need for reform and transformation of these institutions that's almost unprecedented in the face of climate change and a willingness to operate systemically at that level. So we see that change in terms of who takes on the work of international governance as well as how. And in The Price is Right, I think this actually speaks to another question which has come up in the Q&A, where someone has asked, do big businesses need their own geopolitical experts or diplomats in this scenario? In a world where nation states are at best a kind of glove puppet for corporations, or where corporations have fully taken on the role of the nation state, there will still be international interactions. There'll be questions of geopolitics, but whether they look more like corporate interactions is a question that we have to consider and think about how that unfolds. If you consider big tech companies already, it can be the case that it feels like interacting with a foreign government, that they effectively have their own diplomatic service when they speak on the international stage. And I can see Rosemary will come in and say further on this.
Thanks, Matt.
I was just going to make the point, Sophie, that this is a fabulous example. This question is a fabulous example of how the scenarios make you think differently about the question before you get to the answer. So the question was asking about international organizations. And I thought, well, the scenarios take me to global companies are international organizations. If I think about security, then I'm back in the land of government to government type international organizations, cybersecurity norms and the like. Ecological civilizations takes me to, well, will non-government organizations be the international organizations that will have the say? So that to me was just a small demonstration of how having the scenarios on the table can make you think differently about issues, questions, answers, solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary. I think that's right. And I think it's certainly prompting our audience with some few questions. So I will jump to the next one, which I'll throw to you, I think, Rosemary, in the first instance. And of course, Matt, you're welcome to jump in as well. But Rosemary, the question is, do you see the future internet split, which is referenced in some of our scenarios, due to the rules of differing governments, or will it come about through other means?
Sorry, Sophie, the first bit of the question is,
so it's about the fragmentation of the internet and whether it will come about due to government's roles or non-government agencies, I suppose, or organisations. You mentioned ICANN earlier.
No, that question of fragmentation is a really significant one. And again, if I use the scenarios to frame my answer, I can really see that if we're in a world where security is the dominant discussion, then I can see a world where people say and accept, we want our bit of the internet to be much more secure than that bit over there. So we do wind up with blocks and bridges, to use Matt's words. If, however, our task is to work together in a collaborative way to save the planet, then that couldn't be done if you started putting roadblocks in the way of collaboration and information. And I suspect that the community would have a very strong position about anybody that tried to put those hurdles in the way of, open and active engagement. And with the Price is Right, I think there would be much more of a focus on innovation, and that takes me to a single interoperable internet. Whether that will be driven by governments, it's not clear to me that governments will have the main say in all of this. And again, that's a reflection of me mulling over the scenarios. Where all that takes me is to say that the work that we have been doing to support, to strengthen, to share the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance and thereby defend against the technological fragmentation of the infrastructure, that work to me becomes even more important than it has been up to now. Thanks.
And if I might build on Rosemary's point, I think it also speaks to the way William has framed that question in the chat. Do you see the future internet split? It's a reminder, of course, that this isn't soothsaying, that it's not staring into the crystal ball and predicting what is to come, that actually we've manufactured multiple views on the internet, some of which show the internet splitting, some of which show it integrating globally. And I think part of the courage of auDA in this work is resisting taking a definitive, exclusive, singular view on the future, but acknowledging that there is uncertainty, that there are multiple futures. And as Rosemary just said, she used that phrase, it's not clear to me. And that willingness to say, we're not saying it has to be this way, We're not talking the future into inevitability, saying we must have a world of national security and geopolitical competition, or it is inevitable that we submit to big tech. But it's actually a chance to think differently. And the last thing I want to say about that notion of split, an interesting thing that happens with the scenarios work is things that aren't in the scenarios also come to mind because your mind has been stretched. And for me, in the early interview stage of this process, one expert respondent imagined a world in which the geopolitical fault line actually ran through Australia. And because Australia itself, different regions are economically beholden to different global powers already, that in a world in which the Asia-Pacific region maybe had very different defined allegiances and boundaries, that Australia itself might experience this sense that the geopolitical fault line ran through it. So it's really a chance to think differently rather than to fail to be humble and take the presumption of we know how the future is going to be and it must be this whether we like it or not.
Thank you, Matt. And that is an interesting future ahead, should we have a fault line down the middle of the nation. But I think we've got enough to grapple with in these scenarios. But that takes me to our next question, who's from someone who did support us in some of the work on these scenarios. And Chris asks, is there a local or Australian versus a global context in how we might use these scenarios? Matt, I might throw to you with that question first, given your experience in using scenarios over many years.
Thanks, Sophie. And I'll be brief. I was thinking back to that diagram that we showed earlier of an island surrounded by a sea of uncertainty. So what the scenarios really represent at that highest global level is different ways that the sea might come ashore, which were considered challenging to current assumptions, expectations, hopes, and fears about internet governance and how it might unfold. So whether you're working in a global context, a regional context, or a local Australian context, the notion is that one might say, if that was the way the sea was coming ashore, what would it do to my ecosystem, to my part of the world, whether I'm thinking at the level of state government, whether I'm thinking at the level of a domestic private enterprise within Australia, or whether I'm thinking internationally, multinationally, or globally. Any one of these scenarios provides a potential configuration, which you can then say, if that was the way the world was going, what would that do to my particular island of actors and relationships in the here and now? There's a really nice piece of very readable research in California Management Review by Oxford colleagues Trudy Lang and Rafael Ramirez. It's called Getting the Most from Publicly Available Scenarios. And if anyone wants to make use of this work, it's a very nice way into thinking, how would I apply this auDA work to my own particular context?
Lovely, thanks, Matt. And we might be able to provide a link to that in the email we send out to our audience today after this webinar. Thank you. And I might now move to our next question from our audience. And Rosemary, I'll throw this one to you. And I should, just before I launch into it, also say to our audience, we're really happy to take comments as well as questions, as Matt has said throughout this webinar. The scenarios do give you a moment to pause and really think through what may come down the line at us all. So if you just have a comment on that rather than a question for our panel, please do feel free to pop that in the Q&A chat as well. But Rosemary, in the interim, while our audience are pondering that, we have it's a question and a comment. But it's from Bruce, who says, in the last 100 years, oil has been a limited resource that powers many economies, certainly causes many conflicts. Those countries with oil have had the ability to influence geopolitics or change its course. And the question is, are there emerging scarce resources that we think people might pay more for, or that might change the dynamic, such as the availability of computing power or the power of new AI applications, for example? Did that come up in the scenarios, or would you like to comment on that, Rosemary?
Yeah, no, happy to think about that. I think one of the factors that we're dealing with, and perhaps this is picked up by the ecological scenario, is that I don't know whether the word scarce is quite the same as available, But in the last few years, driven by COVID, of course, we've started off a very big discussion about just in case compared to just in time. And people have been talking about the security of water and the security of food and energy security and the like. So I think we are thinking about the management of resources in quite a different way, not assuming that they will be available when we want them and in plentiful supply. So that then takes you to considerations of how you can much more efficiently manage both the demand and supply of critical resources, which absolutely takes you to the use of technology and exploration and innovation with tools such as AI. I think we're at the beginning of our consideration of all of that. And it's like that old saying about the elephant. If you're in a room, feeling the legs or feeling the trunk, then you have quite a different view of what's possible. On the matter of computing, again, if I stick in the ecological civilization world, then the cost of computing to the planet is going to be part of the considerations in that world, quite unlike if I'm in The Price is Right. Then, the cost of computing power in my calculation about what I can charge someone for a health service, I'm not going to be driven by cost of computing. I'm going to be driven by the value of being able to access health services. That will be the basis of the pricing for that subscription service. So again, if I, use the different scenarios, then I suppose the first thing that the scenarios do, Sophie, is they drive me to ask more questions, but that helps me then triangulate. So I think I, get to a better, more informed answer. So maybe that's a bit of a narrative response to that issue, but I just want to I suppose, demonstrate how the scenarios influence my thinking in response to such ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Rosemary. And Matt, I can see you've got your hand up there, so over to you.
Just building on Rosemary's response there, I think about the fact that we already think about rare earths and materials that are needed to create various technologies. The question one can ask with these scenarios is, which resources are considered scarce in each scenario in terms of whether they are actually scarce, but also whether they're perceived to be scarce or perceived to be an issue, just as Rosemary just said with the Price is Right and the question of the cost of computing power. I think also of things that are talked about all the time in this sector. So the notion of the end of Moore's law is always coming, and we're going to see the end of that projection. And in a way, people say, well, people always say the end of Moore's law is coming and it never arrives. But it can be like the turkey which is waiting for Christmas, where each day the farmer is feeding you very well. And, oh, one day there'll be a Christmas, but it's not tomorrow, it's not tomorrow. And suddenly the moment arrives. That need to anticipate and be ready for the thing that we always talk about and yet never seems to transpire. The scenarios provide a safe space to say, well, by 2044, how has this issue played out that we always talk about and which yet never seems to arise? And Rosemary also spoke to this question of AI and autonomous computing power. I think one of the things that's really evident in these three scenarios, in terms of, as Bruce says in his question, new AI applications, is what will prove automatable? What will the cultural, social, and legal response to more autonomous machines and bots be? How will wider society and wider governance interact with this question of increasing automation? And will automation itself plateau in some way? Those are conversations we can have within the frame of each of these scenarios. So I think it is a way of addressing the thing that we can't yet tell how it will play out.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. I'm going to jump to another question from our audience, and it really goes to skills that organisations need to think about into the future. I might throw it to you, Rosemary. So I know it's something you think about often. And the question is about what sort of skills do big businesses need to navigate a world where they are no longer bounded by nation states? So this would go to our Price is Right scenario. Do organisations need staff members or executives who are experts, such as, with diplomatic skills, to navigate that future world?
Yeah, well, it's a world that I occupy a lot, Sophie, and my answer is that large corporations, particularly operating across boundaries, need, and I'm going to call them stakeholder insight and management skills. Diplomatic skills is a subset, in my view, which takes you pretty much into government space. But my sense, particularly, listening to younger people, I think the expectations of community members to be properly engaged in all sorts of important discussions, those expectations are growing, and understanding the community stakeholders and deeply, properly, authentically engaging with people. I think that's going to be a critical skill, and particularly in a world of considerable uncertainty and turmoil. I don't think the answer lies in the technology. I think the answer lies in engaging with the community and then responding with tools such as technology. Because I really feel very, very strongly that we, exist in a socio-technical world, and to just have the one set of skills is not going to be enough. So that's how I think about that one.
Thanks, Rosemary. So important now, but equally or more important in the future.
I think so, yeah.
Thank you. And I have a quick question, Matt, that I'll throw to you, and I'm conscious of the time, so we'll ask this one and we'll hopefully have time for one more as well. But this one is about the future of democracy. And it speaks to, in a world where digital authoritarianism is on the rise, so again, that state of alert scenario, how do you think democracy will be shaped in the future, Matt? I might throw it to you first.
Very kind. I think this notion digital authoritarianism is on the rise. It speaks to this notion that a trend is a trend until it bends or breaks. So what the scenarios do is let us think differently about the future of accountability itself, whether it's those citizen assemblies of various ranges of legitimacy in a state of alert, whether it's that combination of global cooperatives, but an element of also top-down hierarchy in the battle against climate change, in ecological civilization, but also the question of corporate accountability in the Price is Right. One of the interesting things in the scenarios is the notion that we would have younger entrepreneurs, because people would get online, and we would have teenagers setting up their own businesses and enterprises. And they would also, as Rosemary says, younger generations also clamoring for a voice, even in this world where accountability is a matter of corporate accountability. And I would also go further to say this is also about dissent. This is also about the difficult conversations that we have in civil societies that are not just the things that come through the ballot box. It's about the future of the fourth estate, or what replaces the traditional fourth estate, which includes, for example, gaming-based communities in state of alert. So it's rather than saying this is how we think democracy will be shaped, it's to acknowledge that the dynamics of accountability will look very different, and the three scenarios give us a chance to play that out. I'm sure Rosemary may have some more to say to that.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, I went back from the word democracy to the, original intent, which is a way of having discussions that engage the common people. So shared thinking. And I think the technologies that we have now have enabled that in a way that was not possible in the past. We find ourselves dealing with emerging harms around disinformation and misinformation and how to manage that. But my feeling about that is that the engagement of people in processes and discussions is going to become more important. The meeting that some of us are just back from, that was held in Brazil, Net Mundial +10, was in many senses a reflection around the democratization of the policy and governance processes around the internet and a whole range of digital issues. And it was absolutely fascinating to be in the room and see it play out in practice. We had one microphone where there was a very senior government official making a tremendously important contribution to the debate. There was another microphone where there was a very young university student, I think, so nervous that her mobile phone was shaking so much that she couldn't actually read her contribution that she had thought about so carefully. The panel chair said, "We really want to hear what you have to say. So just take a breath and share your idea with us." But to me, it was an incredibly powerful demonstration of the sharing of power that underlies the multi-stakeholder model. And when the final document came out and was read, in fact, the essence of the contribution from this young person had been reflected in the document. So there was a huge cheer from that corner of the world, the corner of the room. You know, I feel very much that this notion of sharing, pushing, pulling, exploring is going to be a really play a really important role. And perhaps my focus is on the democratization of debate, discussion, and ideas. But it was really a magical experience to see that play out in practice.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks, Matt. And again, I am conscious of the time. We've got about 4 minutes left, but I have 2 more really good questions. Definitely time for 1, maybe 2 if we're quick. Let's see how we go. But Jackie asks a question, and Rosemary, I'll throw this one to you.
Sure.
Obviously, we've presented the 3 scenarios in our report and in our webinar today. And Jackie asks, how is auDA thinking about using the scenarios when making in our strategy development process? For example, will we test the scenarios against each other, use one of them, accept them, and accept that they might change? So, Rosemary, I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, sure. The value of the scenarios, I think, in the strategy process is to make sure that we don't do the easy thing. The easy thing is to take the existing strategy and just give it a minor tweak, plus or minus 5%. I don't really think that is in the interests of the Australian community, given the emphasis on digital policy and the internet. So the scenarios really force us, quite literally in the process, to go out to 2044. And if I get out there, I say to myself, is it really likely that in 20 years' time, I'll be doing what I'm doing now? And when I'm out there, that becomes more unlikely to me. So it starts me down a path of thinking, well, what would I be doing if I were running the internet, Australia's part of the internet, for the benefit of the Australian community? And I think what that does is it takes me more in the direction of change and challenge and innovation without having to land on whether I think state of alert or ecological civilization or the price is right is the right scenario. I see all of these as overlapping circles, and working through those circles means that I wind up with better informed, more careful thinking, which is the basis for the next scenario. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
Thanks, Rosemary. I'm really conscious of the time. There is one last great question about the future of the DNS. I don't know if you've got a 30-second answer to it, Rosemary, or Matt. It might be one we need more than 30 seconds for, I'm sure, but in the interest of giving Alban a quick answer, would anyone like to take it on?
I think the DNS, there's a role for interoperability, there's a role for identity and management of resources. There's something at the core of the DNS that I think will be relevant very, very long term. In a sense, it's the details that I think are the things that will change.
Lovely. Matt, any last comment from you?
Yeah, just in terms of this scenario process having provided a stretch, at the outset, the kind of conversations we heard domestically about the DNS were, well, will people have Facebook pages instead of websites? Will we even need human readable domain names because AI will be guiding us around and we'll all be using apps? This takes us further and beyond assumptions like the idea that we're inevitably entering an age of great power competition and that Australia has decided where it aligns because of AUKUS. So I think that very technical question about the DNS, what we've done is put it in a wider framework about the very nature of our networked world and how humans relate to it and govern it. So it's a chance to go beyond just the .au to almost the .everything.
Thanks, Matt and Rosemary, and a big thank you to our audience and to those who may be online who also assisted us in the development of these scenarios. We thank you again. It's been a fabulous discussion today. Thank you for joining us. And while it's going to be some time yet before we know what the future holds, we know as a result of this project that we are better prepared to face it. If you are interested to read our report, of course, it was dropped in the chat there, so please do click on the link. And again, feel free to share it. We really do hope people will use it and discuss it widely. And also, just before we do finish up today, a reminder to those online with us that auDA will be hosting our next webinar on the 4th of June, and it will be considering how small business owners can work to unlock the potential of AI. And it will have a presentation by Wilhelmina Diveston from the National AI Centre. So please, if you're interested to register and join us, you can do so via the auDA website. And of course, the best way to stay informed about auDA activities and also events is to sign up as an auDA member, and you'll receive all of that information direct in your inbox. So thank you again, and a very big thank you to Matt and Rosemary for their discussion and presentations today. And thank you to our audience. We do hope to see you at our next webinar or our next in-person event. We wish you a great day. Thank you.
Hey, everybody.